Now let's look at the German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger. Big thank you here to my Patreon Bodo who requested this topic. Now, there were already some beginnings in the First World War about paratrooper units, but they were rather limited. Billy Mitchell suggested some deployment, but it never saw action because the war ended sooner. Now, the first major power that had large paratrooper units were actually the Soviet Union, the Red Army. In 1932, they had the 1st Brigade. Now, as some of you might know, the Germans and the Soviets back then still cooperated. So the Germans actually got a certain amount of access to this. For instance, Jeschonek, later the chief of the general staff of the Luftwaffe, saw mass paratrooper training exercises where they dropped a large amount of paratroopers, and also there were photos and everything, and Göring supposedly saw these photos and said, well, I want to have something like this. Now, although usually Göring is just seen as this incompetent, well, more corpulent guy, Göring should never be underestimated. In certain aspects he was very shrewd and very dangerous. And he saw this to get his personal unit basically for power politics. And his unit would be the Landespolizeigruppe Berlin. There were several, which means regional police group basically. And his one was for Berlin, and he also requested combat support weapons early on. Now, in 1935, when basically the Wehrmacht was officially announced, or the Reichswehr was renamed into the Wehrmacht and Hitler reintroduced conscription and everything, his unit was renamed Regiment General Göring, whereas the other groups were integrated into the German army, into the Heer, and his unit would stay with the Luftwaffe. So this was the very beginning. So originally it was a police unit. Then for the paratroop exercises and everything, only volunteers were allowed. And since basically no one ever really saw a jump beforehand, they did a training jump with one guy who already did one, and he injured himself. So in the demonstration he injured himself, but nevertheless they had enough volunteers who actually saw this that wanted to go on. So there was no lack of volunteers at this point. And additionally, it should be noted that at this point they were called Fallschirmschützen. So Fallschirm is parachute and Schützen is basically the rifleman. So they're basically paratroopers or para-riflemen. And they set up one battalion of paratroopers and one company of engineers, at least from the organization standpoint, because now the basic training for the training personnel began. And for the first 4 weeks, basically, they only worked with the parachute to get it in order. So for the first, it was about maintenance, how put together the parachute and everything, because, well, your life depends on it. And the next 4 weeks, it was about jumping. Additionally, they also used the infrastructure which was built up during under the Treaty of Versailles, because there was the secret build-up in the Reichswehr, as is explained in one of my other videos, so be sure to check it out here. Then, of course, a lot of technical questions and practice happened. So, initially, how to deploy the parachute. This could be answered rather soon, because to reduce the amount of time the troops would be under AA fire or enemy fire from the ground, the planes had to fly rather low and drop the paratroopers rather soon, so that they will land rather soon on the earth again, on the ground. So only automatic shoot was an option. Now the whole apparatus and everything required that they jumped forward out of it so that the chute could easily open. And one major issue was that during a landing they had to do a forward roll to mitigate the energy and everything. This of course means if you have to do a forward roll during landing, this means you can't have long weapons like your MP30 or MP38 or 40 or your Karabiner 98 Kurz. So only pistol and grenades were usually on the body. Additionally, of course, if you land somewhere where it's a bit rough, you get rather easily injured. So soon they had paddings for the elbows and for the knees to do this. And another major problem is if you land with a parachute, the wind will drag it away. So basically the idea was if you land for the parachute, you run around it so you can catch it when the wind drives over. And there were lots of belts strapped on them. And you couldn't get rid of them while in prone position. So after landing, a paratrooper was really vulnerable for quite some time. So no regular weapon, getting rid of the straps, be careful about the wind because it might drag you away, and also you're a big target or easily to spot with a huge chute and everything. So what was the solution for getting the weapons down there? Basically weapons containers. There were several different ones. They were marked with colors for each unit, and they had in some cases wheels for better transportation and to carry and everything. But the problem is they were dropped separately and usually nothing landed where you intended it. So similarly with the equipment, they realized that the Stahlhelm 35 was basically not very suited. They had to get rid of the seams on the side, and also in the neck it was too strong here, so they adapted it in various ways. I mean, it's a very typical helmet, and they introduced better neck straps and also more padding, which kind of makes sense. Other equipment, for instance, the gas mask were put in a different container because usually it was a metal container, which was quite problematic if you land somewhere. Then they had more ammo belts. They had special ammo belts that they could carry more ammunition because they could put them on. And it was assumed because ammo supply would be limited. And they also have a special knife. Now the weapons were initially identical. But since this was a rather special unit, they got their own development office. So at this point, they could put the requests out there to the industry, and they got special weapons and equipment like the helmet on later on. But initially they basically had the same equipment. Now for transportation, usually the Junkers 52, the Tante U was used, the free engine transport plane, which was a passenger plane before the war. And there was a militarized version which had a better, stronger bottom for transportation, and also later on a gun section. And some other changes. It could carry around 12 paratroopers. So in passengers, it could carry a little bit more passengers, but soldiers have equipment and everything. So around 12 paratroopers and 3 crewmen. Now in March 1936, the first school for paratroopers was established, and first off, again, it was to train the trainers, and the regiment or the regime was basically 5 day jumps and 1 night jump. And this was continued. So this was also continued then for the regular recruits. So in August 1936, the regular training begins. Then, due to the Treaty of Versailles and everything, Germany had a rather strong focus on gliders. So to get basically a lot of pilots or potential pilots trained, they used gliders because they were not forbidden by the Versailles Treaty. And of course, in March 1937, they realized maybe we can use gliders militarily. So they built up a school as well. And so in summer 1937, it became rather apparent, okay, we have now enough volunteers, we have already trained several paratroopers. But a main issue is actually that High Command has no clear plans how to use paratroopers at this point. There's no concept for the strategic use or everything. Additionally, they have already numbers, but the numbers are so low that basically those people that work with the paratroopers think only in tactical areas. Now, the first idea was basically to attack targets that were missed or not hit by bombers. So you drop in your paratroopers or you land them there, and then they use explosives or something and destroy other targets. So basically landing behind enemy lines. So more or less commander duty, and they were called Zerstörertrupps, destroyer units or troops. Now here's a major problem. First off, the soldiers weren't particularly happy about this because basically this meant due to military law they were saboteurs and basically court-martial. Another major problem is, of course, as some of you might know, navigation and recovery. So as we all know, bombing in the Second World War was rather inaccurate, to put it mildly. The same thing happened with paratroopers. And even if they got on the ground and you got about where they were, recovering is even more problematic because you have to do the navigation again and you have to land your airplane there and then you get them in, and yeah, as you can see, nice idea, but not really viable, and also soldiers were not particularly happy about this. Ultimately, the first use of the German Fallschirmjäger happened in March 1938 during the Anschluss of Austria, the occupation of Austria, because since the motorized units had problems crossing through the mountain passes, they sent the paratroopers, they landed on the airport to Graz in Styria, in the southern part of Austria, and they were deployed there. And basically 1 month later, they finally were renamed into Fallschirmjäger. At least the unit was then named the 1st Battalion of the Fallschirmjäger Regiment. Beforehand, they were mainly referred to Regiment General Göring or something along those lines. So this was basically a short intro to the background of the Fallschirmjäger. Big thank you here to my Patreon Bodo who requested this topic, and thank you very much for your support. Well, I hope you enjoyed this short episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.